Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the One of the Many videocast. My name is Rob Guzman, host of the One of the Many videocast. If this is your second or third time dropping by, thanks for coming back to check out more of my material. If this is your first time, thanks for checking me out for the first time. I'll tell you real quick what I'm all about here. So here at One of the Many, what I do is I look at the big headlines in the news and look for the principles that underlie them. I want to seek out the big ideas in the many, the headlines, and help you, the viewer, see the forest for the trees. Or see the forest through the trees. Basically, what we do is we analyze stories and look for the big ideas that can apply to other contexts and help you live a more integrated, philosophically consistent life. So the story I want to cover today is really just one story. I typically do 2 or 3, but this week the story was so big and got so much press, and I have so much to say about it, that it warrants a whole video on its own, and that is the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings and the latest development that he has been accused of attempted rape and sexual assault by one Christine Ford when he was in high school. So what I want to do, and I'm sure many of you who follow politics or read the news a lot have heard this ad nauseum. You're probably sick of the story. If you are, I apologize. I know that you can get fatigued by following one story for too long. I'm aware of that. But this story has so much juice to it. It's got such a huge amount of potential in terms of principles that I just really wanted to cover it. And I think that there's a lot of human interest to it. It's a very fast developing story. The details have emerged day by day. There's like new developments, even hour by hour. Like last week, I was noticing there were just lots of information pouring in, lots of new developments. So it's kept people's interest for that reason. So what I want to do in this episode is start by just talking about the case as such, the facts, what I know about it. Now, you may watch this and something totally new may come out in the next couple of days that maybe change the facts significantly. If that's the case, then I'll cover those changes next week in my next podcast. But for now, I'm going to cover the facts as I know them today. And I also want to provide you a principled analysis of this from the ground up. So not just from the events, but I want to provide you a view of what principles are involved in analyzing and understanding this event and where people are going wrong, horribly wrong in their understanding of this event. So we'll start with the event, qua event, and we'll work our way up. So get a drink, strap yourself in, here we go. So the key players in this are one Dr. Christine Ford and one Brett Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh, you may know, he is the Trump nominee for the Supreme Court, vacating Justice Kennedy's soon-to-be empty seat. Christine Ford is a woman who is a psychologist, practices psychology in California. She is married, has 2 children, and she claims that when she was 15 and Kavanaugh was 17, so 36 years ago, Kavanaugh at a house party grabbed her when he was, extremely drunk, not coherent, pushed her onto a bed, jumped on top of her, held her down, covered her mouth so she couldn't scream, and attempted to remove her clothes and rape her. She claims he was so drunk she thought that he might kill her by suffocating her. Now, what prevented this was the timely intervention of one of Kavanaugh's friends, one Mark Judge, who was in the room at the time. He supposedly jumped on Kavanaugh, allowing Ford the opportunity to escape the premises, which she did. Now, according to a story in the Washington Post where they talk about some of her background and what's happened to her since this incident, she moved to another state. She moved out of the Maryland area, which is where they went to school. She moved to California, where she got married. She got a master's in psychology, and she tried to basically put this incident, as she describes it, behind her and move on. Recently, she contacted the Washington Post to discuss this incident and come out and accuse Kavanaugh of this when she found out that he was being nominated to the Supreme Court and the hearings were being held for his nomination. Now, the timeline is a bit fuzzy, but there's a Politico story that does a pretty good job of essentializing it. I'm going to provide a link to that and a few other interesting and useful articles that I mention here for you to look at if you want to follow up. But the basic timeline goes something like this. July 30th, Ford penned an anonymous letter and sent it to one of her reps in California, who brought it to Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California's attention. Feinstein had the letter in hand July 30th, sat on it for about a month, and came to discuss this with the other Democrats on September 12th. Now, the hearings for Kavanaugh were September 4th through the 7th, so she withheld this information throughout the hearings, where they could have raised any issues that they may have had with Kavanaugh's record or his character, and broke it to the other Democrats on the committee September 12th. Kavanaugh had read about this, as most of us had, by a story in the Post at this point, and Ford's identity had not been revealed. She was still anonymous. Kavanaugh categorically denied all of this, and her identity only became known on September 16th. Now, her attorney has said that she's willing to testify before the Senate. Last week, there was some hullabaloo, some, question about whether she would testify, what the conditions for her testimony would entail, and so on. As of now, so as of Sunday, she's decided, Sunday the 23rd, she's decided that she will testify, and that'll be on Thursday, after sort of back and forth with Chuck Grassley, the Republican committee of the chair for this Kavanaugh nomination. So that's the current news, that she's going to testify before the committee, the Senate committee, and give her take of this event as she remembers it. So the big question on everyone's mind is this true? Is it true? Now, there are some problems with this case that I see. First of all, she doesn't know the exact year this happened. She knows that it happened sometime in her sophomore year of high school. Kavanaugh, of course, denies that this happened at all. She doesn't know whose house it was, doesn't know the address, but she doesn't also know whose home it was, who lived there, or why she was there. She hasn't provided any information as to how she got to the party, how she got home, how she left the premises. She claims that she vividly remembers Kavanaugh, that she vividly remembers his friend, Mark Judge, but she doesn't seem to remember much else, apart from those things. Now, she claims there were 4 people at this house party she was at, and none of them corroborates her story. Kavanaugh, of course, explicitly denies it. The other 3, have come out on record saying they have no positive recollection of it. They don't remember anything about it. So this is questionable. There's no police record. There's no hospital record. She didn't go to the police or the doctor to check any of this out. She claims, a classmate of hers put out a Facebook post last week saying that this happened and it was discussed in school, but she backpedaled pretty quick when she was asked for comment. She pulled down her Facebook post talking about it, and she claims now that it might have happened, it might not have happened. She doesn't remember. So there's a lot of fog. There's no corroborating witnesses. There's no record of this from anybody. She does claim that she's discussed this with her husband, who has said that she's mentioned Kavanaugh by name. And then she had a therapist that she discussed this with in 2012, but the notes that the therapist kept on this incident shows that the incident mentioned 4 boys, not 2. Now, of course, the 4 people that were at the house, of those 4 people, at least one of them were female, not including Ford herself. So it wouldn't have been mixed up with the other participants at the party. Now, Ford has asked, as a precursor to her testimony, that the FBI investigate Kavanaugh further on this matter. Not really clear what they're trying to find here or what they could even do to validate any of this because it's so long due. It's 36 years later. But Chuck Grassley threw that condition out, and now she will testify. So those are the facts of the case as far as they go. Now, I want to briefly mention some of the reactions from politicians and other figures. So you've got Democratic politicians mostly coming out in support of Ford. So here's a quote from one Kristen Gillibrand, the senator from New York, Democrat. Quote, "I believe her. because she is telling the truth and you know it by her story. Judge Kavanaugh has not asked to have the FBI review the claims. Is that the reaction of an innocent person? It is not. She later added, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the optics of this make it look like a man's promotion at work means more to Republicans than victimized women. So right away, what do we see in this alleged reason for believing Ford? Well, her story. Her narrative corroborates it. So the fact that this story jives with Kristen Gillibrand means that it must be true, that she believes it. Sounds plausible. You know, if you ever read a good short story, well, that sounds plausible. I guess that's true. Even though it could be whole cloth, it could be a complete fabrication. The story is enough, right, for Gillibrand. And then this idea that, well, he's not asking the FBI to investigate. Well, you know, you're not expected to call upon the authorities to always investigate if you're innocent. You know, you not saying, I want to be investigated, you know, on this issue. I'm an innocent man. Yeah, you could say that, but just because you don't doesn't mean you're not innocent. So, you know, claiming that you don't want your accuser to investigate you is not evidence of guilt. And of course, this interesting idea that a man's promotion at work meaning more to Republicans than victimized women, we'll get to that a little later. That, of course, doesn't wash. That is a complete non sequitur. You know, the truth of this has nothing to do with victimized women. It's either happened or it didn't happen. Okay? What Republicans are convinced by in terms of the evidence doesn't say anything about what they think about women generally. So that's an interesting thing to say. Another senator, this time Mazie Hirono from Hawaii, quote, another Democrat, quote, I believe Dr. Ford, as I refer to her, because she makes a very credible case. It is really difficult for someone to come forward in this way. Why should she destroy her life? Already there are efforts to cast aspersions on her credibility, to look into her family, all of that. This is really very much like what happened with Anita Hill, where she was vilified, she was called names. This cannot happen to Dr. Ford, unquote. She also said, quote, I put his denial, that's Kavanaugh's denial, in the context of everything that I know about him in terms of how he approaches his cases. As I said, his credibility is already very questionable in my mind and in the minds of a lot of my fellow Judiciary Committee members, the Democrats. When I say that he is very outcome-driven, he has an ideological agenda, very outcome-driven, and I could sit here and talk to you about some of the cases that exemplify his inability to be fair, unquote. Hirono, by the way, also said that on this issue, men should, quote, shut up and own up to what they do, essentially. So I'll say, if Senator Hirono, if you're one of my viewers, I ain't shutting up about this. You can have a valid opinion on it and not be a woman. So let's dispense with that right off the bat. Now, a couple of points that she raises. Well, why would she do this? What does she have to lose? What does she have to gain, right? Of course she's telling the truth. What could be her motive otherwise? Well, I can give you one motive. How about fear? A lot of Democrats have put the fear of Trump into the hearts of the voters. They've claimed that that Trump's election was going to mean the end of women's rights. You had people showing up at Kavanaugh's hearing dressed up like characters from The Handmaid's Tale, which is a science fiction story put out by Margaret Atwood about some author about a fictional dystopian government where the American government is taken over by Christian fundamentalists. If you're worried about women losing their rights and people being forced to be handmaids, you should vacation sometime in Saudi Arabia or Iran. America's pretty far from that, whereas these other countries aren't. So I don't see America coming anywhere close to that. But of course, a lot of these people believe it. I mean, look at the Women's March that happened this last year and the year before that, after Trump was elected. It's become like a new annual pastime, a new annual holiday to go out and protest Trump's hatred of women, of course. And as far as what she has to gain, I mean, she mentions, Senator Hirono mentions Anita Hill. Anita Hill is now immortalized. Everyone's going to remember her as this poor victim who stood up to a man was dispensed with and put to the side. All of the people who agreed with Anita Hill at the time still carry her memory and put her out there as someone who was set upon by the establishment. She's a victim forever emblazoned in the history books. I mean, of course she's got a lot to gain there. So, I mean, she has stuff to lose, yes, but she also has stuff to gain, especially if you are a political activist who thinks that Republicans have an animosity to women. Of course you have a motive to speak up. If you think that it means getting rid of a justice who's going to overturn Roe v. Wade, that's the big fear that all these people are putting into the hearts of their voters. If Kavanaugh is appointed, he's going to overturn Roe v. Wade. Are you afraid of that? Well, okay, maybe you should come up with a nice rape accusation to prevent that from happening, now shouldn't you? I'm not saying that that's what's happened here, but it's certainly a motivation. So this idea that she has no other motive is kind of silly. One more quote from one more politician. I can't do this for too long or I get sick to my stomach just reading these people. Senator Kamala Harris from California, another Democrat. Listen, it comes down to credibility, to your point. It's going to be about listening to what each party has to say. But I believe her. Listen, first of all, anybody who comes forward at this point to be prepared to testify in the U.S. Senate against someone who's being nominated to one of the most powerful positions in the United States government, that takes an extraordinary amount of courage. And frankly, I have personally prosecuted sexual assault cases, and my concern is, and she knows this, she being Ford, she is putting herself out there knowing that they're going to try and excoriate her. She's doing it, I believe, because she knows that this is an important matter. It's a serious matter who serves on that court, and she has the courage to come forward. She has nothing to gain. What does she have to gain? Unquote. So Harris here lampshading what I had just said, that she does have actually something to gain. The Supreme Court judge is an important position. And Harris here says it's a serious matter who serves in that court. So there's a motive, there's something to gain, is to prevent that guy from getting on if you don't think that he's going to rule in your favor. And of course, we see the usual thing that Hirono said, also echoed here by Harris. What does she have to gain? It takes a lot of courage. But notice her first point. It's about credibility. She says, listen, anyone who wants to come forward and testify, I want to hear what both parties have to say. But I believe her. So before the parties have even had a chance to talk about the details and to have a hearing, to have a fair hearing where two sides can get together and discuss the facts here, and Kavanaugh has a chance to confront his accuser and actually sort out what it is she's referring to and explain what's happened. Before that's even happened, Harris is pretty sold that this guy is guilty, right? So this is, again, not a rational viewpoint. I'm going to cover that a little more in detail very shortly. I just want to finish a little bit more on the reactions to this. So Hirono had mentioned Anita Hill. Anita Hill was maybe I didn't explain earlier, Anita Hill was someone who accused Justice Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment and impropriety in the 1990s when he was being confirmed to the Supreme Court. And she testified that he basically had sexually harassed her. It wasn't sexual assault. It was essentially asking her out, not taking no for an answer, talking about lewd and explicit things at work. Clarence Thomas, denied all of this. A lot of his coworkers came out in his favor saying he didn't behave this way in the office. He claimed that it was a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks. That's a quote, direct quote from Clarence Thomas. So there was a race angle in the Clarence Thomas hearings that isn't visible here, but it's the same basic conflict of a male justice being accused of sexual impropriety and a woman stepping forward and saying that he harassed her and was not a good character for this position. So Anita Hill in the New York Times, she's still kicking. She's actually a professor at Brandeis University, a law professor, and she says that Kavanaugh has the burden of persuasion in this case. That's right. It's not that Ford has a burden of proof. Kavanaugh has the burden of persuasion. And she added that 1 week isn't enough time for Ford to prepare for this interview with the Senate. Well, I have to say, first of all, she's had 36 years to get her story straight on this issue. She's had lots of time to think about it. She's talked to her husband. She's talked to her therapist. I mean, she's the one who stepped forward and gave that letter to her rep. She's the one who called the Washington Post. She's clearly ready to discuss this. If all she's doing is giving her side of the story and explaining the event as she saw it and giving facts, what preparation is really needed? You can do it in a couple days. Unless you're trying to audition and practice and rehearse for some show, I don't see why you need a lot of prep for this. So that's one thing. The other thing is burden of persuasion. I mean, this is a law professor who's saying that in a case where you're accused of crime or an assault, it's on you to persuade the audience or the jury or whoever's listening that the accuser's wrong. It's not the burden. The burden of proof isn't on the accuser to show that you've done something wrong. Well, that's a complete inversion of how justice works in this country. It's a complete invalidation of innocence until proven guilty. So if you're a student at Brandeis, or if you have a kid that goes to Brandeis, I'd try and get my money back, because this is absurd for a law professor to hold this. The media generally have supported Ford, with the exception of the Wall Street Journal, who called this whole thing a, quote, Me Too ambush. It's a pretty strong headline. I don't know if I'd call it an ambush, but I think that it's certainly, I tend towards that viewpoint. One journalist at CNN asked that asking a woman to recount her experience about something like this and provide details so as to validate it is, quote, walking a dangerous line, unquote. Joy Behar on The View suggested that Kavanaugh should take a lie detector test. So the guy who's accused should take a lie detector test to prove that he's not lying when he says he didn't do it. How's that for an inversion of innocence until proven guilty? MSNBC wailed about the optics of white men, all these heterosexual Republican white men questioning a female survivor, about the credibility of her story. And one New York Times reporter said that this was a cultural reckoning, and that essentially this goes beyond Kavanaugh. So right away, you've got someone here fessing up that it's not about justice, it's not about the individual case, it's about a cultural reckoning. It's about sacrificing Kavanaugh on the altar of whatever crimes are alleged by feminists to have been committed by men as a gender. So we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the principles. But the last thing I'll say about the facts here are that there have been death threats launched at Ford. Her family is being put under surveillance and watch by the FBI. She's talked to the FBI about her own protection. Kavanaugh has also gotten death threats for this, and his family has been threatened. The U.S. Marshals are investigating and probing those attacks. So it's not just on one side. This has been a messy incident that's basically affected the lives of both people. So what's my opinion on this incident, qua incident? I mean, I've given some leads to it just in the way I've discussed this, but I have to ask this question. If these accusations are bad enough to keep Kavanaugh off the Supreme Court, are they bad enough to keep him off the second highest court in the land, or the third highest court in the land, or any other court he served on? If it's such a big deal, and these were in fact serious things he did, and it was a crime or an assault, why didn't she come forward sooner? I mean, he was a judge for years before this nomination. How did she sleep at night? I mean, how come only now, when it's a Supreme Court nomination, she's decided to come forward and go public with these accusations? Why didn't she discuss the issue earlier? Now, according to her husband, she discussed Kavanaugh a lot at home. But then again, many women in the United States have been discussing Kavanaugh since he was put forward for nomination by Trump. They all don't like, a lot of women who don't like the idea of overturning Roe v. Wade have brought up Kavanaugh as a concern to their elected leaders, and they've written letters to the editor and gone to marches about this. I mean, just because a woman talks about Kavanaugh and knows about him and that he's a threat, does that mean that she was actually attacked by him, and that it's not a different guy, or that it's not some fabricated story? I'm not saying it is, but her talking about Kavanaugh doesn't mean that he did it. Her knowing who Kavanaugh is and what he stands for and what he's all about doesn't mean that he attacked her. So, as far as I'm concerned, there's no evidence here to corroborate her story. And that's really what the standard should be when you discuss this with people and decide for yourself. What does the evidence say? I mean, she claims that he was so drunk that he might have killed her if she hadn't gotten away and Mark Judge hadn't intervened. But what about her? I mean, she's at a small house party in high school with boys. There's 4 other people there in the house. If Kavanaugh's drunk during that time, was she drinking too? Was she doing anything else aside from beer? And she was younger, and she's a woman. She was presumably smaller. She probably had a lower tolerance than Kavanaugh. If he was tanked and he was there and this actually happened the way she describes it, what about her? Was she lucid enough to really remember this accurately? I know my memory isn't infallible. I don't think anyone's is. It's easy enough to confuse one person for another, especially if it's years ago, if it's over 30 years ago. How do you remember something like that? 100%, especially if alcohol is involved. And she hasn't come out and said she wasn't drunk. And it's not just us assessing how lucid she was. How does she know how lucid she was? I mean, I've been to parties before where I was drinking, and I couldn't tell you right now how lucid I was then. Now, on Twitter, there's this guy, Ed Whalen, a conservative attorney, who basically put forward what people are calling the Doppelganger Theory, which is, it's got its problems. It's a little arbitrary. It basically takes specks of houses in the neighborhood and tries to erect a case, and it's all speculation about where this might have happened and what the house might have looked like. And he even goes so far as to pull out a yearbook photo of somebody who looked just like Kavanaugh, was the same year, and actually lived in the house that he showed the spec for. So as much as I can say there's a lot of speculation there and it doesn't hold a lot of weight, it does presuppose that she's lying or that she's at least not telling the full truth or that she's wrong. It at least has the merit of providing an alternative that makes sense in this context, that she could have had a simple case of mistaken identity. That happens. What I'll say is that the takeaway for this event, qua event, if it really was a sexual assault and there was some perpetrator there, whether it was Kavanaugh or not, I think the important principle to take away on this is that sometimes short-term pain is required for a good outcome. If you are concerned that something happened and, it affected you negatively, you should go to the police immediately. Even if you're embarrassed, if you're afraid, you should go. You should go get it checked out with the doctors. You should go get it checked out with the police. Not only will it prevent that attacker from doing it to somebody else, but you'll have peace of mind, and it's actually justice for those people to be punished and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Not simply for them to go free and for you to sort of fade into the shadows. Not only will you never live it down, but they may attack other people as well. So the thing to do here is to understand that the sooner you go to the authorities on these issues, the easier it is to prove that it happened. It's really hard now, if this did in fact happen, for 36 years later to provide any evidence that it happened. I mean, as far as we know, it exists only in the memory of those who were there. And if they were really as drunk as she claims Kavanaugh was, then it's really not reliable in their heads either. So I don't really see that much here as in the way of positive evidence to suggest that this actually happened. Now, the last thing I'll say about this particular issue is I think the actions of Dianne Feinstein in this are contemptible. Now, here you have a senator from California who is on this committee to nominate Kavanaugh. And what does she do? With important evidence that may be relevant to his character, she withholds it from the actual hearings for over a month. She's had it for over a month. The hearings begin. She doesn't mention it, not a peep of it. I mean, this person had already gone to the Washington Post. Feinstein knew who she was. She could have gone to her privately and said, I encourage you to come forward so I can bring this up in the hearings. I encourage you to, at the very least, write an anonymous editorial or write something anonymously to somebody. Give me permission as a senator to come out and mention this in the hearings so that we can vote on this and actually do it appropriately and give it its due exposure in the media. Let people have at it and check it out and comment on it. But no, she didn't do that. She withheld it till the 11th hour. And this was done specifically to railroad the entire nomination process, to prevent it, to put the brakes on it, all with the looming impression that there's going to be this big blue wave of Democratic voters coming out in November for the midterms this year, and the Democrats are going to get seats, and they may be able to vote out Kavanaugh and prevent this nomination from happening if they can delay it long enough. So she's basically sacrificing the interests of this person. The interest being that this, if really happened, should come out and be discussed and vetted. And if there really was a crime here, that justice should prevail. Nope. But instead of concerned with that, she makes it a political calculation. She uses this person as a political pawn to basically prevent some judge that she disagrees with from being confirmed. I mean, that's contemptible. And all these other Democratic politicians coming out saying, well, he's a really bad guy. He's got all these views that we disagree with. He's, as Senator Hirono said earlier, he's outcome motivated. He's ideological. Are you kidding me? Again, the kettle calling the pot black. These Democrats are entirely outcome oriented. They don't care how good a judge Kavanaugh is. All they care about is whether he's going to vote for what they believe in. Is he going to support the laws they want? Is he going to rule the way they want in their favor? And if he doesn't, he's out. They don't want him in there. And even if he's got integrity as a judge, that doesn't matter to these people. They are the definition of ideological, outcome-oriented people. And, she says that she, judges him in the full context, his denial of this assault. She judges it in the full context of who he is. Well, let's also remember the full context here of what's going on. We have a divided country this hysteria about the rolling back of Roe v. Wade implanted into people by the Democrats. There's the spectacle of these hearings where women were showing up dressed in Handmaid's Tale garb, pretending to be characters from this dystopian sci-fi novel where women lose all their rights and the American Constitution is thrown out for a Christian theocracy. I mean, I don't know if you looked around, but we're pretty far from a Christian theocracy. I mean, our president, a Christian theocrat? I mean, Trump is an authoritarian, but we're nowhere close to throwing out the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. We're not close to rescinding the First Amendment. I mean, Democrats want to do it on college campuses. That's the irony here. They're the ones attacking the First Amendment. They're the ones who want to legislate hate speech. What better way to institute censorship and a totalitarian government than with outlawing hate speech? Or banning the Second Amendment, preventing people from being able to arm themselves against government intrusion in their lives. I mean, this is literally the kettle calling the pot black. And, you've got people like Cory Spartacus Booker coming out and complaining about these emails that Kavanaugh allegedly sent and how, this is my Spartacus moment. I'm going to break the rules of the Senate by bringing this up. And it turns out it wasn't a Spartacus moment because it was already on the record. I mean, this was a complete spectacle from the beginning, all of this attempts to impeach Kavanaugh's character, and this is just another instance of it. Also, don't forget, there's the anger over Merrick Garland. During the Obama administration, Obama's nominee was Merrick Garland. The Republicans didn't want to vote on it, so they filibustered and waited. They had the numbers to do it. They played by the rules of the Congress, and that's what happened. And now the Democrats are upset about it. They're pissed, and they want to do the same thing to the Republicans as the Republicans did to them. I get it, but you got to remember the full context. This isn't about women. This is about politics for people like Feinstein, Hirono, Gillibrand, and Harris. And finally, the last thing on this, what about the double standard that exists with people like Bill Clinton or Al Gore or Keith Ellison? There have been people on the Democratic side accused of abuse to women, and the credo isn't believe all women. It's, there's reasonable doubt. They're innocent until proven guilty when it suits us. And when it doesn't suit us, they are waging a war on women, and they need to be struck down. So, qua incident, qua event in the news, long story short, I don't think there's evidence to support her claim. I don't think that she's lying necessarily. I don't know. I think there's a possibility that it might have been somebody else. In fact, I think that if this did in fact happen and she's not a political operative who's basically just trying to cash in on her 50 minutes of fame, if it's true that she was assaulted by somebody, I think there's ample reason to believe that it was somebody else and not Kavanaugh. Doesn't necessarily mean it was him who did it. So I want to talk a little bit more about some higher level principles. We covered a lot so far on this, but there's sort of 3 points I want to cover here. So the first point is, how does this tie into the so-called Me Too movement and feminism? Some people are couching this as the Supreme Court's new Me Too moment. It's the Democrats are holding the Republicans' feet to the fire, and here you have assaulting a woman. Well, first of all, what I have to say about the Me Too movement, I think that the Me Too movement basically packages together two things that don't go together. So, Me Too, on the one hand, is bringing attention to actual cases of rape and sexual assault, both of which are unjust and immoral and should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. If somebody is actually guilty of rape or sexual assault, they should go to jail for a very long time. They shouldn't be released easily, and they should be prosecuted fully. They should be despised, because that's not how you treat people. Now, on the other hand, it also packages together things like the Harvey Weinstein situation, where people are doing things like quid pro quo, where a powerful man in an executive role is offering better positions to women who sleep with him, women who basically agree to engage in sexual acts to advance their career, or in cases where there's so-called workplace patriarchy or workplace power structures in place that are preventing these poor, set-upon women from basically realizing their full potential. And it's all about sex. So what I'll say about this is that the first situation of rape and sexual assault is legitimate, the second isn't legitimate. You have to remember here, and this is the full context of Me Too and feminism generally. So Me Too is a microcosm, it's a part of the feminist movement. Feminism, for its part, is a derivative of Marxism. Marxism, of course, is the idea that people are conditioned by their means of production. They are basically They don't have free will. They don't have consciousness. Every idea to a Marxist is conditioned. It's a rationalization. And basically, it's all about classes. It's an oppressed class and an oppressor class. Basically, the individuals are just instances of this class. There's this sort of back and forth struggle where you've got one class that oppresses another. That class basically stands up and revolts against that other class. The two kind of merge together in this weird Hegelian synthesis. And then this sort of waltz, this three-step of, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This goes on and on and on. And of course, Marx wrote about this in an economic context, but for feminists, this is all about in a gender context. They're applying this in terms of men are the oppressor class and women are the oppressed class. And essentially, it's entirely deterministic in its orientation. Feminists believe that it's all about power structures. It's all about power, men wanting power over women. And basically, to a feminist, concepts, things like love, commitment, responsibility, these are nowhere to be found in the ideology because they can't square that with determinism. They can't square that with this sort of power struggle view of life. So you have to remember that for feminists, this whole incident, this Kavanaugh incident, is kind of one of their big opportunities to push this feminist message and get it so that men are cowed into submission. They want to basically they basically want to remove all vestiges of masculinity and femininity from the public space. And they are doing that by a number of means, but one way of doing this is by essentially making men feel guilty and pushing them out as sex assaulters or abusers or rapists or potential rapists, and basically weaponizing sex against them. You saw this during the Clarence Thomas hearings. Sex was weaponized against Clarence Thomas. It's being weaponized now against Kavanaugh. And it's a general trend that it's happened on college campuses as well, where now the burden of proof on college campuses is reversed. It's in fact the case now that in many cases on the college campus, when it comes to rape or sexual assault, the standard of proof isn't innocent until proven guilty. It's preponderance of the evidence, which means if there's equal evidence for that this guy assaulted somebody or didn't, we're going to err on the side of the accuser. You need more evidence. You need to, in other words, prove that you're innocent. There needs to be more evidence that shows you're innocent rather than evidence that shows you're guilty. But it's not, the burden of proof really in that sense is on the accused and not the accuser. So this is a general trend. It's a general microcosm of the feminist movement, the overall feminist push. And I think that I'll go into more detail on feminism and its roots and where you can see it elsewhere. But this is one area where I think this issue relates. Now, another issue, and this is a little bit more fundamental to the justice system in America, is guilt and innocence and how we basically adjudicate guilt and innocence. Basically, if you come out and say, as Hirono, as Gillibrand, as these other senators, as Harris, said, well, I'll hear the testimony, but I believe her. Before any evidence comes in, you are rushing to presume guilt. And you're basically saying that the burden is on Kavanaugh, like Anita Hill did. The burden is on Kavanaugh to prove he's innocent, not for Ford to prove that he's guilty and to provide evidence that he's guilty. Now, there have been cases of false rapes. They do exist. There's the University of Virginia case. There was the Duke Lacrosse case. There was a case at Columbia where this girl, known as Mattress Girl, basically accused a guy of rape. The university later apologized to him because they found no evidence to substantiate her claims whatsoever. And I mean, even if you go back in history, I mean, there's this old story of the Scottsboro Boys, these two black men who in the early part of the 20th century were basically accused of rape by white women on a train. And it turned out there was no evidence to support it. They were exonerated. They, in fact, are one of the most historically famous cases of rape that they were exonerated from, on the grounds that the women who accused them were racist and didn't want to sit with a couple black guys. So, there are cases where women will accuse men of rape and it doesn't actually happen. Even if you look at it fiction, I mean, the famous book, To Kill a Mockingbird, I mean, that whole premise, the whole story behind that is there was a black man accused of rape. There was no grounds for it, and it was all done for racial reasons. So, on a wider point, the presumption of innocence before guilt is in accord with a bigger principle, which is, the onus of proof principle, which I said before. In logic, you cannot assume arbitrary things without evidence. Okay, you just can't. If I told you, for example, I think there's a little panda at the center of the earth, and whenever it laughs, volcanoes erupt, and whenever it cries, hurricanes strike. You'd look at me and say you're crazy, but I'd say, well, okay, you have to prove that I'm wrong. Prove that it doesn't exist. Prove that this panda doesn't exist. And if you can somehow drill to the center of the earth, I'll tell you, well, it's an invisible panda. Or it's a panda that's so small you can't see it with the strongest microscope. Or it's invisible and you can't see it, but it's a metaphysical panda. Whatever that means, It just exists in your mind and, it has causal efficacy. I mean, these are all absurd, arbitrary things. And it's the same thing in any other case, in any other crime. If I accuse you of stealing my phone or murdering my cat or abducting my child or anything else, if I accuse you of losing my car keys, the presumption is innocent until proven guilty. I have to basically prove that before any suit can be brought, before any damages are paid, before any sentence is passed. And it seems like when it comes to sexual assault and rape, the mantra is believe women in all circumstances and basically just throw out this presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Why? What's the grounds for it? There's no grounds epistemologically for this. There's no grounds ethically for it. And so I think the fundamental here to take away is that people have this tendency to rush to judgment because they hear a story that they think is convincing. They hear a narrative that gels with them. And so, like Kamala Harris or Hirono, I know by the story's sound. I know the story makes sense to me, so I'm going to basically assume he's lying and that she's basically telling the truth. Again, justice requires objective evidence. You need objective evidence for that. That's why we have innocent until proven guilty as a standard. That's why we have the onus of proof principle. Now, the last point I want to make, and this kind of goes along with the onus of proof principle, and this is a little bit, this ties in innocent until proven guilty, but it also ties in the so-called identity politics crusade. So it actually weds the feminist point with the innocent until proven guilty point. And that is, you shouldn't believe a gender, you should believe the truth. So Kavanaugh's girlfriends, his wife, other people have testified to his high character and the fact that he's a good guy in everything he's done with them. Well, why do we overlook their testimony and not Ford's? Why are people willing to ignore what they have to say, but they're willing to believe some other woman? So when it comes to accepting what all women have to say, these Democrats aren't even consistent in their own worldview. But supposing they did, and supposing they said, well, we can't adjudicate it, but we believe all women. The point is that women aren't a monolith. Women are human beings. They have flaws just like anybody else. They can lie. They can tell the truth. They can want things for good reasons. They can want things for evil reasons. There are women who disagree on all kinds of political issues. There are women who support Kavanaugh because they're pro-life. They're not abortion. They don't believe in abortion. Not all women. This may be news to some of you who are really, democratic in your view, and you're pro-leftist. Not all women agree on abortion. It's actually pretty much split down the middle if you look at the polls. So there are women who don't agree with it. So it's touted as a women's issue, but why is it that only one side is looked at as the right position when it's an ethical argument that people make? And I'm personally not pro-life. I believe in the right to abortion under certain circumstances, but it's not like women are a monolith and that if you're not a leftist or a Democrat, you're not a real woman. So the truth isn't modified by whether you're a woman or you're a man, whether you're black or white. Your identity does not change your ability to tell the truth or to lie. And it doesn't change your ability to perceive truth. So if it doesn't matter if all the Republicans who are sitting in front of Ford during her testimony are white men, straight white men. It doesn't matter an iota. It doesn't change their ability to understand facts, to process objective truth, and to come out with a fair assessment of what's happened. Now you can say that they're wrong or that they're flawed in their own ways, but at the end of the day, making it diverse, this is another thing about this issue that kind of drives me nuts. It's like, the optics of all men, all white men questioning her. If only they had some black women in there or some black men or some white women on the Republican side to question him. It's like, what difference would that make? Having a diverse cast of people doesn't change the objective truth of what has been done and what's been said. So you need evidence. It's got to be objective, and your identity doesn't change it one way or the other. The lens that this whole incident is looked at is a collectivistic one. The idea here is that Kavanaugh is not an individual. He's some kind of symbolic effigy of everything that is wrong with what the left thinks in the world. And that is that white heterosexual males have too much power and they have to be made to pay. Now, individuals for these types of people don't really exist. They basically just symbolize a larger structure, a larger collective, a larger identity group. Okay? And it's all about this larger narrative. There's a larger ideological story, and so we can afford to ignore the individual facts for any individual case on the grounds that this larger narrative is more important, that this larger narrative has more weight, that it has more metaphysical significance. Now, I am an individualist. I believe that all that exist are individuals. All that exist are individual humans, entities that exist as men and women. And they basically act, they have ideas, they have values, they do good things, they do evil things. You have to look at the facts of the case. You can't let your view of men or women generally color the facts in any individual case. Justice requires that you know what happened, what the evidence for it is, and you rule accordingly. So, as a takeaway, as a final takeaway on a very long video with a lot of points and a lot of things that have been said, I want you to take this away, take it to heart, that if you find yourself drawn to one side or the other in this case, try to make sure that your view of it is colored not by your prejudice about white men or women or whatever it is. I mean, this happens on the other side too. There are men who are misogynists and they think that women lie, and so they just side with the man in every case. You shouldn't do that either. You have to look at the actual evidence, the actual facts in the case, and ask, is my position consonant with the evidence? And if it is, great. If it isn't, you have to reassess. So, with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of it. I'll join you again next week for another rousing episode of One of the Many. Until then, have a good week, and see you later. Bye.